Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
That's one small step for man.
One eyewitness, one major pop cultural event. You Had to Be There uncovers stories that shed light on our most iconic moments.
Like the real enemy.
Each episode, our host, Julia Thompson, takes on the task of finding and interviewing one person within 48 hours who was there, with no idea what their event will be. Come along for the ride.
Hey, Julia, you ready for your assignment?
Yep.
Julia, your assignment for this episode of You Had to Be There is to find someone who was in attendance when CNN launched from Atlanta, Georgia on June 1st, 1980, just 45 years ago, marking the beginning of the 24/7 news cycle. Starting now, you have 48 hours to find someone who was there and interview them. Good luck.
You've been working on this thing about CNN, or not CNN, but Ted Turner for like years, and it's coming out soon. So I'm curious, out of all the Ted Turner iconic moments, why did you choose this CNN launch to be a You Had to Be There episode?
So, yeah, I've spent the last year and a half working on my newest podcast, which is called Media Moguls. And it's kind of like hardcore history, but based on the people who built and transformed the media industry over the last 100 years. And what better person to begin with than Ted Turner, who revolutionized cable, sports broadcasting, and then created CNN, which was the 24/7 news cycle. And CNN is just such an interesting thing because when it was created, it was more of we think of things now as startups, but back then it was really a startup funded entirely by Ted's own money. And he was taking on 3 networks that made 30 minutes of news each day for over $100 million a year with only like $30 million in budget. So it's very much a David and Goliath story, but full of a lot of characters and interesting elements. And I thought that if we could talk to people who were there, just what were they thinking? Ted had a requirement by the FCC to air news every day on TBS, but he aired it at 3 a.m. So he wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of news before CNN. And so it's very much a story that we talk about CNN today, or we think about the last 30 years of CNN post the Iraq War and their success there. But we don't really talk about the beginning. And I think the beginning is really fascinating, as it always is for these You Had to Be There episodes.
This news service will be called the Cable News Network and will program continually updated half-hour segments of national news, business news, sports, and features 24 hours a day. I know that we will succeed, and I pledge to you that we will not let the American public down. We sign on June 1, and barring satellite problems in the future, we won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
My name is Julia Thompson, and I am the host of You Had to Be There. My association with CNN is that it's wallpaper. I see it at every airport, every medical office, and playing in the background when I'm hanging out with my mom in her apartment. But if I'm being honest, I don't watch it. I don't have cable. So when I got this assignment, I wasn't necessarily jazzed. It wasn't like Miracle on Ice or Nirvana. 24-hour news is just kind of on in the background, and when I actually pay attention to it, it makes me pretty anxious. And it's general knowledge that cable news has distorted our perception of reality. So what is it about CNN that is so pivotal? I know that there is something there. Webb wouldn't assign it to me otherwise. Was CNN different from what it is now? What was the original idea? What did it do for the world? For me, news is entertainment, and I'm not sure that's always a good thing. Was it always this way? I decided to call my former professor at Columbia, Jack Lechner. I took a class with him on the history of TV. He was also on Jeopardy 4 times, so I thought he might be a good person to put me on the right path.
Well, first of all, television news has always been entertainment, and the line between information and entertainment in television news has always been porous. If you go back to the first days of television news in the 1950s, the anchormen, and of course they were men, would be sitting at a desk, and in front of them would be a display of the sponsor's products. In the case of John Cameron Swayze, who did the nightly newscast on NBC, it was Camel cigarettes. And he would be smoking a Camel while giving the news, and then would turn right from the discussion of whatever just happened that day in Europe to making the sponsor's pitch, talking about the virtues of Camel in the new crush-proof box or whatever it was. Something that we could not even imagine anyone doing now, even on, the most partisan or opinionated or entertainment-heavy news show. So the border's always been kind of porous. Having said that, the idea was always we are trying for an objective reporting of the facts, despite the fact that, of course, it's, as we all know, that is a very elusive goal, because human beings are human beings, and we all have opinions and we all have perspectives. And even that objective reporting of the facts in the first days of TV news, think of all the things that they're not reporting fully and accurately. The struggles of Black Americans, and the struggles of women, and the struggles of gay Americans, the struggles of anyone who is not in the mainstream. Not to mention the fact that news in the 50s and 60s and 70s was all through the lens of the Cold War, so that even when you're reporting objectively on what's going on, it's all within that perspective. And, as famously reported by all kinds of people, the news in the 1960s regarding the Vietnam War was shot through with government propaganda until such time events began to make that impossible for the government to keep up. And in fact, it was television news in the 60s broadcasting the horrors of Vietnam straight to people's living rooms that really turned the opinions of Middle America against the war.
So Jack cleared up something for me. Television news was always entertainment. So there's that. I assume that this whole 24-hour business intensified the need to diversify and create new forms of entertainment news. But I guess it was always kind of like that. So going back to that story I did about the original Mac, I think what's most striking is what Apple was in the mid-'80s compared to what Apple is now is like apples and oranges. I think that's true for CNN too, and I want to better understand that. So how did the birth of CNN lead us to where we are now? I get in touch with a camera operator who was at CNN for 40 years. He was there, but tells me, I'm not worth an interview. But you know who is? Richard Roth. I get him on the phone the next day. Richard Roth was one of the original CNN reporters. There on the first day, and just retiring, I think, a few years ago. He was even in Iraq during the first Persian Gulf War, reporting from the front lines. Here he is.
My name is Richard Roth. I was there at the start of CNN, and it has been a very long road through a changing media environment and a news consumption, but CNN is still going strong. I had read, as most media people did, that in 1979, we read that Ted Turner had commissioned the start of the world's first 24-hour news network. And he had given Reese, Schoenfeld, and a few other people like 6 months' notice to start this network. And I was interested in it, but I really didn't apply anywhere. I didn't know where. This was pre-internet days. And I believe I just kept working until the phone call came in and said, would you be interested? I needed to be convinced still. I recall flying down to Atlanta, which would be the headquarters of CNN, and seeing my friend Jane and her husband Rick, And we actually, very indicative of the future of CNN and money, all three of us slept in the same bed at this dingy hotel or motel in Atlanta. And Ted Kavanaugh, one of the first executives of CNN, was on a higher floor. And we recall that he came down to visit me. And I think it was sort of a pep talk saying, come on, join us. And I guess I said yes.
So did you think that it was viable? Like how much of a risk did you think they and you were taking at the onset?
The idea, obviously, what's been talked about, but the idea of a 24-hour television news network was highly criticized. People scoffed at it. People said, how are you going to fill up that time? I know it seems incredible now, but how are you going to, keep telling the same story over again? Or we knew it would cost a lot, and it would take someone like Ted Turner, who, of course, was criticized also in the early days because his only experience with news on his superstation, TBS, was Bill Tush putting a bag over his head, the anchorman, and reading news. And it was a total, goofball treatment of television journalism. So people had legitimate questions about that. I said yes. And this is the key phrase of this interview or the sentence, that I wish I had been told when I walked in the door 2 months before we went on the air on April 1st, 1980, April Fool's Day, my first day of employment. I mean, if someone had said to me, you will be at CNN for nearly 45 years, it may have calmed me down and made my career go a little easier. But you couldn't think in those terms. And yeah, there was a slower pace, I think, to deliberations. Obviously, now we know that somebody could send a tweet and change the world, which I think was good that we didn't have that, because I saw the change over time, how, you could be on vacation 5,000 miles away and someone could call you and ask, where's the stapler? So it was a good time to start, in hindsight, a 24-hour news network. ESPN became the first sports network, I think, a little bit before us or after us. So it was that very fertile time for linear television, and everybody knows you were paying for really only a few channels, but you got 300 channels eventually on cable television. But those subscription fees helped keep CNN going. But it was Ted Turner who kept CNN alive. We weren't told all the financial details, but CNN, we were really losing money, a ton of money. And in 1981, ABC, I think, had something called satellite news channels, which would have been a very tough competitor for us, especially with ABC's money, and they folded. I don't know if they wanted to merge with CNN, but they were eliminated, and that really helped CNN get its feet really moving.
What do you remember from the first day? I know you said you don't remember much.
I had been there for 2 months. If you'll permit me this brief story, which I think says so much that you just reminded me of. We had no setup to transmit video or live appearances to Atlanta in the weeks and months before we went on the air. So as a test run, a reporter would shoot a story, and someone had to go to the airport to ask a passenger if they would take the report that we had prepared and carry it to Atlanta. And we would tell someone at CNN Atlanta, this is the name of the passenger, this is what he or she looks like, meet them at Atlanta Hartsfield. It sounds incredible now, but that's what we were doing. And even 9 years later in China, I was still doing it post Tiananmen Square. Can you imagine someone coming up to you now at LaGuardia Airport and saying, sir, would you mind, can you just take this package with me to Tulsa?
So it turns out Richard was there on the first day in the sense that he was heading up the assignment desk at the CNN New York bureau, but he was not in Atlanta. He was in New York. I think it's worth getting his story, but I'm not sure that this particularly meets my assignment. So I go back to the lines and end up getting in touch with John Huey, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal at the time that was covering the launch of CNN and Ted Turner. I'm going to jump between John Huey and Richard Roth for the duration of the podcast.
Okay. My name is John Huey, and when CNN launched on June 1st, 1980, I was the Atlanta bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, and I had been shadowing Ted Turner for most of the month of May in preparation for a long page-one article that ran the week before the launch. So on the day of the launch, I got up and went to it and witnessed the birthing of CNN.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit about how you ended up shadowing Ted Turner in those weeks leading up to the launch.
Well, the CNN, as a public company, Turner Broadcasting was a company that the Atlanta bureau of the Wall Street Journal covered in its natural course of, and we had 5 or 6 reporters there. And I chose the Turner story as my own to follow, and the build-up to CNN was very fraught. There was all kind of drama. There was an RCA satellite fell out of the sky. There were dust-ups with the unions in New York City. There were a lot of people in the established order of both news and broadcasting who really didn't want Ted to succeed, and frankly didn't really think that he would. So it had all the elements of a good story. Plus, Ted was a known quantity at that time already because he had won the World Cup sailing race. Is it World Cup? Yeah, that's right, right? Or am I thinking soccer?
John was talking about America's Cup, which Ted won in 1977.
Yeah, anyway, in Newport, and sort of shocked everybody with his persona. And he owned the Atlanta Braves, which he broadcast on satellite on his WTBS superstation, and he had gotten in trouble with baseball leagues for behavior unusual for an owner. So he was sort of an outrageous, outspoken, animated character. And when he announced that he was going to do this, he was the subject of some ridicule, some interest, some just dismissal, and it just seemed like and I knew there was going to be a dramatic launch, and I just wanted to know how this was going to work out and what it meant, and it had all the elements of a good Wall Street Journal page-one story and of a continuing story that the paper has followed to this day.
Can you talk to me about, or walk me through a couple of the key moments in those weeks leading up to the launch?
Well, yeah. You mean key moments for the business or key moments in the reporting? The reporting was really interesting because I would do things like go to the baseball game with Ted, and Ted would yell at the players, and then we would drive. We went out to his kids' Beauregard and Rhett's Little League games, and he yelled there. And then I remember one night, when I first started reporting, CNN was in the Turner building, which was an old house on West Peachtree. They didn't have any furniture. The anchors and everyone was sitting on the floor, and they were sort of. It was a bunch of adults in the television business who had fled their mainstream jobs. Mostly they were either local anchor types, local broadcasting types from around the country, or people who were past their prime in network. But they were all sort of there. They had signed onto this ship that was sailing off into uncharted waters, which Ted often used nautical terms. And they were all sitting around with no furniture trying to make this thing come together. By the time it actually, and then there was an annual meeting. We covered an annual meeting, and they had to announce that the RCA satellite had gone down. They weren't sure they were going to have a satellite that could actually put this up. There was a big lawsuit against RCA that they had to provide a satellite anyway because RCA was deemed to be a competitor because its ownership of NBC, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but I remember one night as we were getting toward the end, the set was being built, and it was a very nice-looking, fancy set. He had bought an old Jewish country club right next to Georgia Tech called the Progressive Club, and it had a kind of faded but august columned building with big steps on it, and you went into and where the swimming pool or tennis courts had been, they'd put up a number of these huge satellite dishes. It was a satellite farm out in the country club, and they didn't really fix up anything that didn't need to be fixed up. They were in short supply on money. And one night we came home from a Braves game, I think, and Ted drove his Chevrolet Caprice up the steps of the club, like bam, 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 bam. The steps go up, and he gets out, and we're parked up on the steps, and he's waving his arm across the satellite dishes, and he's making all these pronouncements. And I remember I asked him, I said, because some reason I was put in mind of this, and I asked him, I said, Ted, have you ever been to San Simeon, which, of course, is the Hearst estate in, on the Northern California coast? And he looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about, and then he got in his car and he said, no, I've never been to San Simeon, but I've seen Citizen Kane 50 times. And he just started laughing and banged down the steps and drove off into the night. And so that's what it was like covering Ted Turner. It was just, you never knew. So you would assume maybe he wasn't following something, but he was totally following it. He had a different way of approaching it.
Back to CNN reporter Richard Roth. What was Ted Turner like in the early days when you were first working with him?
Well, I was in New York. I had two titles, the deputy bureau chief and mainly the assignment editor. I was the assignment desk. There was no one else with me. And I never forgot, on day 2 of CNN on June 2nd, somebody in Atlanta called and said, what are your 8 story ideas for tomorrow? It was very difficult to keep your head above water in those days. Now, what's notable, and I'm not avoiding your question, but what's notable is that the New York Bureau was located in the lobby of World Trade Center number 1. So again, if someone had told me, oh, by the way, planes will crash into this building in 21 years and you will be dead, the whole place would collapse. Fortunately, we moved, pardon me, ahead of that. But your question was about Ted. And he was just this showman. We knew that he had a lot of women, that he had money, that he made it a lot from his father's business, but that he was he was involved with television. There were projects, flamboyant, crazy guy. And the stories did start, someone in Atlanta would say, oh, there goes Ted Turner. He's right next to me. Or there's Ted Turner in a bathrobe. Or there's Ted Turner bringing a wrestler around, or we could hear the noise of the wrestlers above us. But because Atlanta was the headquarters, so you knew where the ranking was, and that took off even years later. Atlanta was super powerful. I mean, if someone, even a security guard in Atlanta called up, nobody would say there's a security guard. They'd say Atlanta's on the phone. Very powerful. But New York CNN helped keep CNN really going in the early days. We had the access, we had the newsmakers. We were ahead of the Washington Bureau for about 2 years until the sheer weight of stories and the numbers overwhelmed us. But we had a live studio, of course, or an anchor desk. Mary Alice Williams was our first bureau chief and anchor woman. We weren't just some far-flung bureau that would get a phone call. She had to be on the air, I think, 5-10 times a day. And people people came in. It was the world's first financial television show on a nightly basis. Moneyline, there was a show. It really, in the early days, if you went out on the street with a camera crew, people would say, "What is this? What is CNN?" Then as the years went by, you would hear, "Oh, that's affiliated with HBO," or "That's that Ted Turner thing." And now, of course, 45 years later, you get people go, "I don't want to talk to you." So the big day was June 1st, 1980, the day that CNN went on the air. And I remember that it was a Sunday. And of course, I remember thinking, "Oh, God, why do we have to work on a Sunday?" But I lived on the Upper East Side, so I would take this train down to the subway down to the World Trade Center area. And we were participating on that day. They wanted to show off all the places we had broadcasters or cable casters, however the correct term is. And the place was busy, but we all knew each other by then. So it wasn't, thank God, the first day of work for everybody. And Mary Alice was on the set in New York, and the set looked out through the glass windows on the first floor in the lobby of World Trade One, and you could see people. And over time, you could get a gauge on how popular a guest was. So there would be just a guest sitting in front of a camera and this huge glass window that people could stand and look in. And I remember one day, maybe in 1981, Jacqueline Smith of Charlie's Angels was there, and the outside hallway near the elevators at World Trade One were packed. You could see people panting on the windows. And then I think the next day we had the Nobel Prize winner for economics, and there was nobody standing there watching.
That's really funny.
I remember that the night before, or the morning of, the civil rights leader Vernon Jordan was shot. And I remember thinking, "Oh, that's too bad." But I remember thinking, "Oh, at least we have a story." And that propelled our coverage.
Good evening, I'm David Walker.
And I'm Lois Hart. Now here's the news. President Carter has arrived in Fort Wayne, Indiana for a brief visit with civil rights leader Vernon Jordan. Jordan is in serious but stable condition now at Parkview Hospital. He is recuperating from the gunshot wound suffered early Thursday morning. Police still have no solid lead on who attempted to murder Jordan.
Jen, we were live with White House briefings, I think. I mean, that had never really, I think, been done before, at least more than the evening newscast. People didn't have to wait till 6:30 at night to get the news. There was no crawl, the words that move across the bottom of the screen. That started during 9/11 and never changed. So it was I wish I could remember every day after that. I told you I remember the what are your 8 story ideas from a call her in at CNN Atlanta. But I mean, look, I was not involved in some big relationship, and I didn't, thank God, at the time have pets. I could focus on going down. You know, you never knew when you would leave, of course. This was not, you knew you were not in for a 9-to-5 job with holidays off. That was not happening.
Do you remember any major catastrophes in the beginning, like production catastrophes?
There was a famous reel. In television terms, it's not used often now, but there was something known as the Christmas reel, which were outtakes, fumbles, anchor, disasters on the air. And you would be surprised at what you saw on the air. I remember there was I think a news executive, that's right, who thought he was off the air, and he kind of faked a heart attack. And this was one of our big executives. And then I recall during Reagan assassination coverage, which was about 10 months after we went on the air, and I remember the reporters, standing outside the hospital where President Reagan was recuperating. And I remember saying, "Is that NBC's catering truck?" I don't know why that line has always stayed with me. But that of course happened when you suddenly put a group of people, a large network, and say, "You're on the air almost every minute," and things started happening. But it was, as you know, it became our bumper sticker almost that, we're in cable. Cable is cool. CNN is cool. Now that, of course, changed over the years, but we really were a unique, plucky underdog at the beginning. Television unions at various stations made an effort to cut CNN cables. We were derided by them. The famous phrase about CNN from its critics chicken noodle news, CNN, and that was sort of the best they could do. Now, if you told those rough technicians who were bothering CNN in those days or cutting our cables, if you told us, well, in 8 years they're going to be applying to work at CNN, and that's what happened. So things really could change in the television industry.
How did 24-hour news change television news?
Tom Brokaw, it was 9 years later, but during the Berlin Wall collapse fall, I believe, quoted CNN, or it might have been the Iraq War. I think it was the Iraq Gulf War, that Tom Brokaw of NBC News had stated that the little CNN has become a network or a big time thing.
CNN used to be called the little network that could. It's no longer a little network.
I mean, it took us 9 years or so, but that period had some unbelievable news stories that I was able to participate in. Gulf War, Tiananmen Square, Berlin Wall, end of communism. So how did it change television news? It made all the other networks wonder what did they do? Were people really sitting at home? It turned out obviously there were millions of people who had different lives, different schedules.
Totally. So can you talk a little bit about being an anchor?
Yes. Well, I wasn't an anchor, but I was right in the middle as a reporter or as a bureau chief at Humongous Stories. It became quickly clear that a reporter would get used up pretty fast, and you would have to have the stamina. Of course, many reporters, if you show them a camera, they love it. I mean, there was said of the former UN ambassador Richard Holbrooke, where is the most dangerous place in the world? To be standing between Richard Holbrooke and a television camera. I could see the change in other people and other guests, people who would be a novice at the first time, and then 10 months later, they're saying, can I get a copy of that? Let me have my limousine in by 5 o'clock. It was exciting to be on live. I, of course, had very little training. I don't think I ever got any training. I think it was all natural. But I had never really done on-camera stuff, and I was the assignment editor. But on the weekends, I started doing pieces. And I was very hesitant about doing live. I would get very nervous. And then I think about a few months in, because I didn't have many chances at it, I just was watching, I think, some sports anchors, and I saw very relaxed people. And it just hit me like, you know what? Just go with it and wing it and just be yourself. I mean, you could not really fake it. I mean, the camera, as we know, can expose anything. And that's what happened. I think I was covering the Howard Beach racial attack court case. And by being on live or doing a lot of reports during the day, it kind of gave me that experience. Overseas, during those big stories, look, in Israel, I was there up on the roof when the Iraqi Scud attacks occurred. At the time, it seemed like the biggest story ever. Fast forward 2 or 3 decades, and you have Iran and Israel exchanging all these missiles. Every story I did, it seemed like the biggest story in history. And then as time went on, we have some bigger implications to every story. So if you were a reporter, you had to focus on that camera. If you look away, as I would tell guests, if you look away, it looks like you're shifty. It looks like something's about to happen on camera. But there were many experiences while being on television. You don't see your earpiece, but you're waiting for a cue. And many times, maybe no one told you, hey, you're on. I mean, when I was on the roof in Tel Aviv, there's a piece of video. I still don't know if it aired on CNN Live, where the day that Israel was attacked for the first time by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and I raced up to the roof where our camera position was, and I can still hear my voice saying, I don't even know if anyone could hear it. I go, you have no soundmen up here, and then a guy yells, look, look, look. And I turn around and I see an Iraqi missile kind of seemingly headed towards us, and I cursed, which I never do, even in public. And I don't know if that ever aired, because they could record whatever was coming down the line. And I have a video of that, which I would sell to a high bidder. So these are some of the things that could happen. Once you get in front of that camera, you own it. And of course, you have to make sure the line is booked or the satellite. So you're never totally sure in situations. But my phrase, which maybe others have copied from me, in this industry, you're only as good as your last live shot.
I asked John when Americans really embraced CNN. When did people start to take it seriously?
I can remember two events that brought that home to me in coming years, if you'd be interested. But one of them is right after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. I was sent to Romania, and they had torn down the statue of Ceausescu in the square in the circle there, and but riding into Romania, it was a kind of a bleak into Bucharest, kind of a bleak place, but there were satellite dishes sticking out of all these Soviet-looking apartments, and my driver said, everybody figured out how to get CNN. We knew what was going on in the world, and CNN was often cited as a factor in the fall of the communist bloc. So there was that, and that that was and then again in 1999, I was at a Time Warner event and sitting at a table with Ted and Jane in Beijing at the dinner celebrating the 50th anniversary of Mao's Long March. And there are 5,000 people in the room, and a lot of them have on Mao jackets and eye patches. We're sitting pretty far back, and it's just a spectacle of seeing this many people fed that quickly and whatnot. And at the end of the event, the Great Hall of People is this huge room with big Chinese flag hanging, red flag. And so Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, the leaders of the country, go off the stage and they start working their way through the crowd, and they're shaking hands and whatnot. And it's clear they're headed somewhere. And then it becomes clear they're headed toward us. And then they get there, and it's clear that they're there they want to see Ted. They want to shake Ted's hand. They want to be with Ted. Ted is the most important non-Chinese person in the room to them. And there were all these other people there, but Ted was who they wanted to talk to. And I'll never forget this. And I thought about it, and it's because, he had started CNN. To them, he was like, Prometheus or something. He had so Ted handed me one of those little disposable cameras like Fuji or Kodak used to make, and he lines up this picture in front of with the big flag in the background, and it's Jerry Levin, Dick Parsons, who were the chairman and CEO or COO of Time Warner, and Ted and Jiang Zemin, the head of China. And he says, I want you to take this picture. It'll be historic. It's got everything. It's got a Jew, a black guy, a communist, and an atheist. And he was the atheist. And I'm like, yeah, this is history, all right. But in all seriousness, I was like, that's what it was like to be Ted Turner. A lot of people in the room still probably didn't take him seriously because of his affect. But the head of China took him very seriously. And the head of China also knew about the Cartoon Network, by the way. So anyway, as years went on, I realized the significance of CNN and that launch and the chances that Ted took to do it. And, he overturned the business model. He was very instrumental. When I left the U.S. to move to Europe for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and I didn't know anybody who had cable. When I came back in 1984, everybody had cable because they were watching MTV and ESPN. ESPN started about 6 months before CNN, and nobody watched either one of them for a while. But in a very short period of time, everybody signed up to cable because they wanted to watch this stuff. And then, of course, famously, by the time Desert Storm came around in 1991, and Bernie Shaw and the great AP reporter whose name I can't remember right now, stayed in the hotel room for the bombing, and that is what made CNN something that was just a fixture, and you had to have it in case something happened.
How did he conceptualize this if he had so little money compared to the other networks that were doing 30-minute news, whatever? And then why was it that the other networks didn't take CNN seriously?
The answer to your question really is twofold. Ted had an enormous appetite for risk and an enormous belief in his ability to harness both the cost savings and the mass distribution of satellite technology. And he knew that if he could get both those things going, the technology and something that people wanted to watch or needed to watch, that he could get mass distribution with very little cost relative to what you're doing if you're running a network out of New York and Los Angeles with union tech staffs and all kind of backups to backups to backups. So he was just, and he didn't have any, he was very familiar already with the fledgling cable industry pioneers, the people like John Malone and Chuck Dolan and the guys and Cox Cable in Atlanta, the people who had started cable. That was his customers. That's who he was selling to, them and advertisers. He didn't have to worry about affiliates, rich people who own stations who are always making demands of the NBC or CBS or ABC. He didn't care about any of that. He had to sell ads, get some eyeballs. He had to get some eyeballs, sell some ads, and get enough going to where he could raise the fees on those cable operators. And the cable operators, they were deregulated, they were unregulated, and they all knew him. And it didn't take them very long to figure out that his success was their success too. If CNN succeeds, if ESPN succeeds, if MTV succeeds, cable gets bigger. So they all made each other very rich, building an industry that is now sort of on the downslope. But it was a hell of a run for a long time, and most adults today, except the youngest, sort of grew up in that model of, in pay TV, the HBO that was added on to cable area. We all grew up with some form of cable, and of course, DirecTV took it another step further by delivering the programming by satellite. But anyway, he just had huge risk. I think he probably had less money. The stories I have heard since then from various people inside the company, I would guess that he actually had less money than we knew, and that he was, I think he had trouble. I think he had I know of some stories where he had some desperate times at just making payroll, but he just had, like most great entrepreneurs at some point in their arc of their building their business up to the breakthrough point, he just was willing to live with empty pockets, and he always drove cheap cars. He did not live a high life for a long time, and he had a vision, and he had the risk. He was willing to take the risk. I think, unfortunately, somewhere along the way, he took too many risks, and it interfered with his sovereignty to keep doing what he wanted to do. But he ended up having a pretty nice life anyway, billions of dollars and the largest landowner in the country for a long time. But he saw something and he made it happen, and it changed all of our lives, and it may have freed some countries and just changed the way we know what's going on in the world. Now, the flip side of that is maybe we should have asked the question, well, if they're on 24/7, what in the hell are they going to put on there? Because you can't just keep reading the news over and over. And so, as we all know, they gradually or quickly developed a business model among all the cable news channels, regardless of where they are in the pecking order or the ideological spectrum. They're all built around the idea of raising your cortisol level. Breaking news, making you excited or angry or upset or whatever. So it's all about, and the concept. When I was writing that story in 1980, it never occurred to me that we would have a country where people would actually sit around their houses all day watching the news. I mean, the evening newscast had only gone to 30 minutes a few years before. It used to be 15 minutes. And now we live in a country where people just sit and watch the news all day long. I mean, which I think I would have perceived as a big negative had I had that crystal ball back then, because there isn't that much news. And there's certainly not that much news that you need to digest all day long. And it's probably not good for your health, mental.
Yeah, and I suppose if there was news, let's say there is news that's worth publishing, it's not what people necessarily want to watch.
No.
So, yeah, there's that part too.
It's like it's sort of been subsumed in the Trump era. It's been subsumed by the sort of the wrestling model. A lot of cable news now resembles wrestling. You're just really just waiting for somebody to break a chair over somebody's head or leap out. It's way up the cortisol level. Now, in fairness to CNN, they also were a pioneer in online news, and they and Yahoo were the first two places on the internet to give away news, which totally changed the news business too. Not necessarily in a good way, but CNN is still one of the largest providers of digital news in the world, and so it's still a dominant brand in news. So Ted Turner really started something, and it's been through many iterations, and we'll go through many more, but I don't think it's going away.
So the origins of CNN are quite different from what I expected, especially based on where cable news is today. Ted Turner really had his finger on the pulse on how to present audiences with more programming, not just in news, but in all facets of entertainment. One of the more interesting things John was saying was the impact that CNN had on the world. For example, in quote-unquote, freeing a few countries. I assume CNN was driven to report on what drew ratings. But since this was the first 24-hour news cycle, so to speak, how did CNN decide what to put on the air? How did they determine what was newsworthy and or entertaining? I decided to hit some experts.
I'm Stephen Livingston, a political science professor at George Washington University. I'm in the School of Media and Public Affairs. And 20 or so years ago, 25 years ago, I was doing research on what is called the CNN effect. And if you were to Google that, I guess my name comes up.
And just in a couple sentences, what is the CNN effect?
The CNN effect is the proposition that real-time television news, and comes in other formats rather than just television these days, has an effect on the foreign policy and military agenda of the United States and other governments, and that it can rapidly increase the pace of policymaking, it can interfere with policymaking, or it can actually, in some instances, so it was claimed, actually set the policy agenda. What the latest crisis is on CNN becomes the latest crisis to be paid attention to by the U.S. government. Turns out it's more complicated than that, though. One of the things that comes to mind, and I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. I'm not a millennial, let's say. I've been studying this for a very long time, or I used to study it. I've moved beyond it. But one of the things that's hard for people, I think, today to sort of get their head around is just how much of a novelty CNN was and how hyped it was. I think it would be one way to get at that would be to think of CNN as a sort of proto-internet. It was the internet before the internet. The internet didn't exist. Cell phones didn't exist. And so you had this medium that billed itself as a global news channel. And it carried that off in most instances. It felt like it was a global news channel if the kinds of events that it was covering were planned in some sense. In other words, early on, CNN was patchy. It could do live broadcasts, but only if it had enough time to send a bunch of tons of very expensive equipment to set up a satellite uplink unit or otherwise make arrangements for satellite uplink units so as to do the broadcast live from wherever it is that was doing it. And, you know, it did that. But I think, at least in my view, we need to keep in mind that it was a bit of a novelty for its first 10 years. It was interesting. We have to keep in mind that the White House, in allocating a seat to it in the press briefing room, used to derisively call it chicken noodle news because of its sort of upstart quality. It wasn't taken very seriously. And that changed eventually. So at first, it was, you know, as they say, sort of the internet before the internet in some ways, though most people certainly didn't use that metaphor because the internet didn't exist yet.
So how were they determining where they were going?
Good question. Most often, in fact, that's a very good question that we can pick up on as we continue our conversation. As was true almost always, the news media followed the lead of the government. Let's think about that for a little bit. Sociologists, political scientists who studied such things consistently found after the Vietnam War that news media tended to follow the lead in news stories from the government through press releases, press conferences, etc. So this was also true of CNN, at least at first. One of the more noteworthy examples of CNN doing something kind of interesting and eye-catching was when it covered the summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik. My memory tells me that was 1987, but you'll want to check that. They had enough time. Obviously, it was a major international summit between the two global superpowers, and so they CNN sent the needed kit, all of the satellite uplink units. They were C-band satellite uplink units. Again, hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment, and even getting it to these places was extremely time-consuming and costly. The size of the equipment is going to be an important part of the story. It meant that in sending this satellite uplink equipment where it was needed, where there wasn't local satellite uplink units from wherever it is the news story was, meant that they really needed to be sure that it was a newsworthy story. And when presidents are meeting with their counterparts in the Soviet Union, you know, that would be one of those cases where, yep, we'll invest in that. So for the most part, CNN was following the lead, like all other news organizations did, of what the government was saying was important. And that began to change over time. The CNN really reached its point of maturation, where it really went from chicken noodle news to being really seriously regarded was with the 1990-1991 Persian Gulf War. This is the war that was to repel Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. It was George Herbert Walker Bush who led the charge with that. This is the period of time where you had emerging superstar media generals who were giving the daily briefing. You had journalists like Arthur Kent, otherwise known as the Scud. Scud missiles were a kind of missiles that the Iraqis had, and so this guy was the Scud missile. That was his moniker. But otherwise, he's a Canadian journalist who used these uplink units to report on events on the periphery of Iraq and Kuwait. And you began to see here with that war, 90, 91, really CNN reaching a point of serious credibility. This is also the key here is you had 3 CNN journalists in Baghdad at the start of the American bombing, and they were reporting live over an audio feed from the Al Rashid Hotel in downtown Baghdad as the American military is starting its bombing campaign through some complex audio logistics. They were able to continue to do this live from the city, and that's the point where people really just took notice of what CNN was capable of doing. It was spunky. It was doing things that the other broadcast networks that existed back then weren't doing, figuring out ways of covering the news, and that really put CNN on the map. That reporting from Baghdad during the initial stages of the bombing campaign.
I interviewed Richard Rust. Actually, he was there too.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, he was he was one of the people who was key at the getting the logistics done. So from that point on, CNN becomes not chicken noodle news, but CNN becomes CNN. It had a gravitas to it and an importance to it that had eluded it, in my view, up until that point in time. And this is where my personal story starts kicking in. In some ways, I could say that CNN was responsible for the first 15 years of my career, because I ended up following around the question of how does the evolution of satellite uplink equipment and the way in which reporters report from war zones, that equipment changed over time, and so too did the nature of war reporting. And that was, as I say, the focus of a lot of my research. So, if you begin with the clever use of simply running a cable, there was just a super long cable that CNN utilized straight out of Baghdad. I don't remember where it went, Amman, Jordan or someplace, but it was just clever use of existing technology that allowed CNN to cover the 91 bombing campaign.
Here's a clip of some of that coverage.
We're going to Bernard Shaw in Baghdad. Right.
This is something is happening outside. Peter Arnett joined me here. Let's describe to our viewers what we're seeing.
Ted Turner was clever in a lot of ways using coaxial cable, but one of the things that he was really clever about is realizing the potential of gaining access, of paying to use a transponder on a new telecommunications satellite. And it was that insight that allowed him to actually claim that CNN was a global broadcast network. The early satellites were C-band satellites. And they use these big parabolic dishes that measure 30 or more feet across. They require big generators. There's a lot of ancillary equipment that goes with it. And also, very importantly, it required a technical crew of people who knew how to operate these uplink units. So that was an early challenge, and that's the reason why, one way or the other, the use of these uplinks to cover something remotely, like from a war zone, it really had to be something that was important, and it took time to set up, et cetera. So if you hold that in mind, during that 1990-1991 Persian Gulf War, a lot of the reporting took place in Riyadh and elsewhere on the edges of the war zone, and the kind of reporting was either, again, audio only. Why? Because the bit rate, the satellite uplink unit, could not handle the data streams that we take for granted now with handheld devices. So rather than pictures, it was most often just audio that was being transmitted. But then as things developed, it switched over to image feeds, usually from some kind of rooftop someplace on the edge of the war itself, somewhere outside in Saudi Arabia in most instances. Look up Arthur Kent. He became very famous during this period of time for his rooftop reporting. And every once in a while, the Iraqis would launch a Scud missile, and you could see it streaking across the night sky and maybe blowing up somewhere, on the edge or something. And that was the nature of the war reporting because of the limitation of the available uplink units. Within a decade, you go from those large, expensive, difficult to use C-band uplinks to KU band, which you go to a parabolic dish that's just a couple of feet across, 3 feet maybe. It can be broken down into a couple of cases.
So what trends did you notice? Because obviously at some point it became, like when was the tipping point with ratings versus technology?
The technology was never orthogonal to the ratings. The technology drove the ratings. I mean, I can guarantee you there was not an eye that was awake that wasn't watching CNN during that bombing campaign in '91. I mean, it had a lock all over the world on people paying attention to things.
So then now where we're at today, like how was the CNN, like your defined CNN effect, like how did it inform today where anyone can grab a camera and capture stuff?
Yeah, I think remember when we first started talking, I said part of what was so interesting about CNN was this novelty. And it's really important for us to put our heads back in that time. It's hard to imagine, no cell phones to speak of, or big cumbersome ones, no internet. So CNN was the first new shiny thing that was fast and immediate and live. I think that today we are so inundated by that technology and that capability, we don't pay attention to that fact anymore. I think a lot of Americans just allow events to wash over them, and the novelty has disappeared. And I just don't see. I mean, I think the cable television channels, the multiplicity of them, have a very different purpose today than they did in the 90s and certainly in the 80s.
What would you say the purpose is now?
It's not a purpose, it's an effect. The new CNN effect is also you just call it the cable news effect. It ends up becoming the place where we have our existing beliefs reaffirmed. If you are a liberal, then you watch MSNBC. If you are these days a kind of a normal sort of Trumpy person, a Republican, you watch Fox. If you are a fervent one, you watch One American News or something else. Or if you're really, really committed, then you forget all of that and you go to some YouTube channel and really get the dose of what you're looking for from a YouTube channel. So you've got a fractured media environment, totally different from what existed in 1990 when it was the broadcast networks and CNN.
I check in with WebBar. And I think the biggest thing for me, and I guess what I want to talk to you about, what was most surprising, was for me to really understand that this was a technical advancement. Like,
oh yeah.
I know this might make me sound stupid, but I never really conceptualized CNN as a technical advancement. I conceptualized it as a new way to ingest content or TV, but I didn't think, oh, wait, this had to be this whole like satellite hookup situation that wasn't thought about before. So I guess my question for you is like, why was Ted Turner, somebody that didn't really care about news, the person that like figured this all out?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The technology is really important here. It's really one of those things where nowadays you can just launch a website and you don't have to think about building the infrastructure behind it, right? We can create a website in like an hour, and we don't have to build the internet. We don't have to build the code or any of that. It's all done. It's basically just putting it together and pressing publish. With the satellite, Ted was the second person to launch a cable channel. It was called the Superstation, and that was in '76. The first was HBO, and that was paid. So the Superstation was free. And they were essentially running old television shows that were licensed or that they owned. And then Atlanta Braves games and Atlanta Hawks games, because Ted owned both those teams. So he could do that. And I won't get into the dynamics of what those things meant because that's a whole nother podcast. However, he was looking to the future in a world where he knew that there were some issues. By licensing all that programming, that meant that those programming owners in Hollywood or the syndicates or the networks really kind of had a gun to him in the future of like, oh, we're just going to raise our rates and keep on raising them. They, for years, tried to get Congress to step in and basically stop the cable growth. And a lot of that was through because they felt that cable was taking their programming for lesser fees because they were going nationwide and paying local fees for that programming because the Superstation was out of Atlanta. I'm sorry if this is a little backwards. So I'm about to get to the point, which is the satellite with Ted looks, I think he's at a Atlanta Hawks game with his senior leadership at Turner Broadcasting. And they start talking about future channels where they can, quote, control our own destiny. And by that, I mean where they don't have to license all their programming from someone else that is going to jack up their rates or make it really hard for him to to keep providing a valuable business for cable operators and for viewers. So they look at what's out there and they say, well, we could start a sports channel. And he realizes that'll cannibalize TBS because that's why a lot of people watch the Superstation for the Braves and Hawks games. And they know that ESPN is about to launch. And that's around 78. And then they look and they're like, what about music television? Well, they're like, who would want to watch music videos? 1981, we learned that MTV, that there's a lot of people who want to watch music videos. So they need programming that is ownable and in theory cheaper, and that they're not beholden to someone else who can continuously just raise the rights on them and can go to the government and basically end their game or make it really hard for him to operate. And so finally he says, what about news? And all of his executives kind of like look at him and they're like, is this the same guy who says no news is good news and that airs the news on TBS at 3 a.m? And they're kind of just like, what? And there's been a few people that have been pitching a cable news network to Ted for years, and forever he said, no, I don't want to be in the news business. It's all negative. And then he realized basically he had another transponder on a satellite, which is like a spot on the satellite. And he realized that this was the way to kind of control his own destiny as a media broadcasting company. And that if no one else was going to do it, he might as well do it.
It's so wild. And I think for me, like what I was saying, I didn't approach this story thinking Ted Turner would have anything to do with Steve Jobs. But I'm leaving the story being like, oh, wow, this person really took a certain aspect of tech that wasn't accessible to everybody or wasn't used for the regular people and then created this thing that everybody consumed and changed the world. Like, of course, he cared a little bit about programming, but it seemed at the end of the day, he just had this. He was able to like re-envision media.
It's a weird thing.
I thought I was going to learn more explicitly about entertainment and news, but I think what I left with was how technology impacted the way we understand and ingest news, which is kind of a cool landing point. And I think also an exciting landing point in thinking about, okay, I want to learn more about this guy and what else did he do? He owned a baseball team. Like who is this person? Here are some final words from John Huey.
Well, the only thing I would say is I would assume that you probably have a younger audience, or although maybe not, you are focused on history. I don't know who listens to that now, but you would know. But I would say the older I get, the more I realize that everything comes in cycles, and technology especially, and technology has revolutionary cycles that are faster and faster and faster. So, like in my office here, I have every version of every iteration of mobile phone that I ever had, and you look at it and you just go, well, you know, the world changes. So whatever it is you think you're used to now, if you're a 30-something or a 20-something, or that whole universe just disappears on you really quickly, and there's usually somebody there. So whatever it is you hate about social media now, or whatever, it won't be around very long. It'll be something different, maybe better, maybe worse. And I would say when I look at what Ted did and the changes he's made, I'm very aware of all the negatives that came along with it. The idea of 24-hour news and cable ubiquity and everything. But I would say on the whole, if I had to judge Ted and what he did, I would say we were better off having him do it than many other people who could have done it. And I consider Ted to have had a positive influence on society and global society and the news business. And I understand that he's in pretty bad shape these days, still alive, but he's got, Lewy body dementia. And wherever he is out there, I hope that I think he cares more about the environment and his legacy there than any of this. But I hope that he feels good about what he accomplished, because he really did accomplish a lot. And I can tell you, he had more fun than any 100 people you're likely to meet in his life. So
that's my goal. So that's pretty good.
Well, follow the Ted. Ted was just a great character who did a lot, and that was an important day. And actually, once a little surprised when somebody asked about it, and I said, June 1, 1980, launch of CNN. Yeah, I was there. I'd love to talk about that.
You Had to Be There is a High Bar production, created by High Bar. All episodes written, edited, and hosted by Julia Thompson. Produced by Julia Thompson and Webb Barr. Additional editing, sound mix, and engineering by Vishal Nayak. Opening score by Teeny Lieberson. Artwork created by Dylan Lathrop. Special thanks to our parents, friends, and chosen family. And most importantly, thank you to the artists who have inspired us, because they had to do it.